Looks like we're live. Just check a couple of other things here. Just make sure this is all booted up. All right, great. Hello, everyone. It's a good morning for me, good whatever time of day it is for you. And welcome to this something like the first episode of what I'm playfully calling for now living history. And this is part of this series that I am offering in part because I just want to be able to talk about these things and I want to share them. And I feel a lot more alive sharing them. So there's a very quick recap of the idea of this. And by the way, it would fill me with a lot of joy if you're here live, if you could say hi. Just let me know that you're here. Let me see you here. So the quick recap of what this series is about, and then we'll get into today's theme. The idea is that there's this kind of arc in which the forces that shape humanity are not a type that humanity is used to thinking about or explicitly orienting to. We'll talk about some of the effects of it, but inconsistently. These are very, very large forces that guide how we think, how we feel, how we intuit, what resonates with us. This is stuff like why it is that we have this idea that keeps showing up about how love will redeem, or love is the strongest force in the universe. Like, where does that come from? What is the relationship between love and romance? Why is romance, like, what does romance have to do with Rome? What is so Roman about what is romantic? Right? We don't usually ask these questions, but this is just one quick example. There are many, many, many examples like this that just permeate our consciousness. Hi, Rishika. We just sort of permeate our consciousness and permeate our embodiment and what it is like to be here in the modern world, or arguably the postmodern world, where we're looking at this chaotic mess of a situation that we're currently in. And we are, I could see your comment again. Yeah, so like romantic, never thought of that. Yeah, a lot of this stuff just runs invisibly, and that's the point. There's this invisibility to our lived experience, what it is that guides us, the forces that shape our mind, forces that shape the expression of our hearts and what we choose to do, what work is worth doing, what kinds of charity we choose. So that's the idea of this series, is to highlight these things, to make it a little more conscious, to invite an opportunity for these things to be material that we can talk about more explicitly. But in an important way, although this being a public thing, this is not in my program, right? This is not part of a training situation. This is more like fun. This is playful, exploratory, and maybe a little bit like, oh. Right? But despite it not being an intense container, like it can't be, this has an episodic nature to it. I want to make sure that people who join in on these things can just hop in and get a taste of it and hop out and hop in, etc. Or you can get sort of the current going across each case I'm doing each week. But you'll get a lot more out of this if you don't view this as just an intellectual exploration. Okay? The mind is important here, and the intellectual understanding is important. These are ideas, they're perspectives. This is exactly the kind of work that the mind is for. But if you keep it chattery, then you'll miss something. What I'm trying to point out are more like the vibes through history, right? The sort of feel, right? Like there's a kind of arc having to do with the way that classical music became romantic music with all its bombacity and drama. And that became the kind of music that went into early films, when the films weren't spoken, but were instead, when we had silent films, there was often an orchestra that would play with the film. I don't know about often, but sometimes. And the idea was that the film would get its emotional arcing from the orchestra that would play. This is where we inherited the kind of dramatic, bombastic music that you often find in modern films. That was one of the defining characteristics of Hollywood, that even after they could record people speaking, and you could get some of the drama a little bit like you're watching a play. And that was what some of the early films were, just adaptations of plays. There is a way of holding the arc of the emotional movement. And that has as its ancestor this feeling of the power and the movement of it actually has as its ancestors stuff like Mozart, stuff like Vivaldi. And their music, in turn, got its inspiration from church music. It was church music made for the new age, the blossoming age of the Enlightenment. So when you can feel this stuff, and then now when you're watching the film, there's something that changes when you can feel, oh, this, like the fact that there's this dramatic crescendo of music, like while you're watching The Batman, and there's this and you go, okay, there's like this drama to it, the drama of the intensity. That is actually calling on something that is similar to what Gregorian chants were doing in order to evoke a sense of the sacred. One thread. So as you learn to feel these threads, these are not just facts to know. These are ways of feeling the shift in your contact with the world. So when you hear people talking about ideas, when you hear proposals, you get these expressions like never again. Never again has a very special meaning over the last 70-ish years. Right? But that actually has an older thread. Like so when you feel these arcs and you start to notice, oh, this is not just a conversation of today. This is a conversation that has been going on. And I am rehashing, like by my embodiment and by what I'm doing. This is how I'm rehashing the past. That doesn't mean it's irrelevant, but it does mean that if you aren't conscious of it, you are just a vessel for the past. So if you want to consciously engage with the conversation at the forefront of human consciousness and the evolution of the world, it's really important not to know history, but to feel it. That's why I was sort of playing with this being living history. Okay? So that's a quick snapshot of this. For today, what I want to explore and play with and talk about here is this so when I announced this, I described this as the memetic thread of salvation. So these threads I'm talking about are like threads through history. They're memetic threads, very much like DNA. When you trace DNA back through biological ancestry, you find a very particular sort of arc that happened. Okay. So in that same way, when you trace back the history of a vibe or an idea, you'll find a kind of history to it. It's sort of like DNA, only it's for the kinds of, it's for memes. It's for these structures that shape large groups and movements and thinking and intuition. So when I talk about the memetic thread of salvation, salvation is not really the best name for it. I'm not quite sure how to name this. But what I'm talking about is that there are a couple of strategies that the West developed, and there are analogs in other cultures, but the West took over the world. So I tend to focus on the memetic threads of the Western world, because those ended up like defining the context for global civilization at this point. So the relationship to something higher, this business of there being something higher that you can align with, that you can attune to. So salvation being one strategy, one way of orienting to it, one way of making meaning. But the reason I wanted to talk about this is because we don't have conscious strategies for this anymore, not as a collective. So I'm going to give some quick examples of what I mean, so this feels reasonably grounded. So if you rewind about 1,000 years in the history of Europe, roughly in that time period, Christendom was at something like its peak, very solid. Like what it meant to be alive is you were alive within the domain of the church. Like this Western Europe, the Byzantine Empire had its own thing, but Like just to simplify things, we're talking like France and Italy, Germany, like these, although those those didn't coherently exist at the time, but like that kind of region. At that time, how do you orient to what it means to live your life purposefully? We have a weird way of orienting to purpose today because there's a kind of trauma, there's a scar on the Western soul that we're dealing with now. And so this sense of what is meaningful, what is the purpose, has this kind of oscillation thing of it feeling desperately important and it feeling boring at the same time. It's a very specific inheritance. John Vervaeke, is a professor at the University of Toronto, describes this as the meaning crisis. I suspect he picked up the term from somewhere else, but this is something that's new as of the last about 200-ish years. It's not completely novel, it had threads before then, but if you go back 1,000 years, the West didn't have this kind of existential angst. There was fear, there was confusion, but it wasn't, there wasn't a kind of meta confusion. There wasn't a sense of, how do I live my life? Well, it's very clear. Like you live your life by going to these magical ceremonies held by these sorcerers. Of course, you'd never use these terms, but I'm just highlighting something of the quality of it. When going to Mass was not this numb, mechanical thing. It was a recognition of, we are in God's realm. This is the realm of God. Like all of existence is the realm of God. And God has deemed there to be priests who are his vessels. And those priests perform acts of magic. You go to communion, and in Mass, you go through communion, which is that you take, it's not just this cracker and wine. It's not just, oh, this is symbolic of the flesh and blood of Christ. It was something that, like, part of the teaching was, by the magical power of the church, the cracker would become the flesh of Christ by transmutation. The wine would become the blood of Christ by transmutation. It is a miracle. And by the consuming of these things, you are taking Christ into you. And by doing so, you are maintaining your connection to salvation. You are taking in the work that Christ has done to pave a new world. So that's part of your cosmic context. And the cosmic context boils right down to, what does that mean I do today? What do I do this afternoon? Hey, there's, like my garden has some weeds in it. Well, obviously I tend to the weeds, right? Well, I need to like go milk the cow. Like there's a very practical grounding to it. But this wasn't just a bunch of isolated to-dos floating off in a void. It isn't just, I do these things because I'm supposed to in some abstract way. It's that you are here on earth as part of God's mysterious will. And part of the process of you going through this physical world is you are enacting God's will. Now, the concept of will is not something that showed up as a major factor for about another 800 years. It was the 1800s that the West started really focusing on this question of willpower and force of will. This is like Nietzsche's attempt to deal with the problem of nihilism left in the wake of cleaving meaning. Okay. But I think it's easy for modern minds to look back at the past and sort of pretend this is about enacting God's will. Right? Not my will, but thy will be done. So if you can sort of hold that as part of the implicit context and understand that, like, I'm doing a little bit of translation. This isn't like, if I described this to a peasant at the time, they would probably think I was nuts. But I'm describing something because it was real and present. There was a living thing there. So this is just one example of many, many, many examples of this business that this is not important. Physical world isn't important. or it's not quite real. It's not the whole thing. That there is a true world or a higher world, a deeper world that is the right one to attend to. And if you attend to that world, then you become aligned with the good, the true, the beautiful. Here I'm using Neoplatonic framing. The Neoplatonism, one of the best modern myths that we have that really depicts Neoplatonism is the Matrix. This is why Neo is called Neo. It's Neo for Neoplatonism. The Matrix is a representation of the physical world, and the idea is that there is a true world within which occurs the false world, the world of shadows. But if you can attune to the higher world, or the true world, or the deeper world, then you attain a kind of salvation or a kind of resonance. In particular, you get a kind of power. In the Matrix, this is depicted by the fact that once you are popped out of the Matrix, then when you go back in, you can recognize certain ways of interacting with the world of the Matrix so that you can bypass laws of physics. You can do really miraculous things. You can just suddenly learn things because you download them from beyond the physical world into the real world. Right? From the real world, you can work with these different programs, etc. If you think logically about the story of the Matrix, this doesn't actually quite make sense because the software that forms the Matrix wouldn't change based on simply the person knowing that it's a software program. And what is the difference between telling somebody this is a software program and somebody popping out of the Matrix and then going back in? What is it about them going back in that lets them manipulate the code? This seems like terrible security on the part of the AIs that are trying to control humanity. You'd think they would notice rather than having to run agents inside of the program to try to get, yeah. So there's a kind of illogic to taking that story too literally, but taken as a kind of metaphor, this is gesturing towards the same thing. This underlying myth, the myth of the higher world, myth of heaven in Quechua. Yes, and this is pulling from something way outside the West, but I'm just trying to highlight something about how universal this is as a human experience. Quechua is the local name for one of the local tribes, traditions, peoples of Peru, right, prior to the arrival of Europeans. I'm probably butchering the name, but when you look at Peruvian Shamanism, like the people who are bringing in all this stuff about ayahuasca and so on, like that is coming from the Quechua people, if I understand right. The Shipibo shamans. I hesitate to call it a religion because religion has this vast scale vision to it, but we'll call it a religion for lack of a better term. Their shamanic religion had a higher world and a lower world, like the three worlds, very similar to the Norse. In fact, most shamanic systems have something like that. They say that our world is suspended between a higher world of the spirits and a lower world of the demons. And you can see obvious echoes of this in Christianity, where you have heaven and hell, which are somehow above and below. Right? So these threads are they're just utterly everywhere. You find it in Buddhism. You find it in the shamanic religion of Bon, the native shamanic practices of Tibet prior to the appearance of Buddhism. So like this business of attuning to something else in order to transcend and in order to bring in a capacity for power, this just saturates our intuitions as humans. Not all systems hold that, but basically all of the wisdom traditions do. Anytime you're dealing with any kind of magical system, there might be some exception somewhere, but as far as I can tell, every practice of magic, you can find this in Voldun, one of the shamanic religions that came out of Africa that became what we now know as voodoo. Voldun is working with spirits from where? It's not this idea of spirits are just invisible but walking the same physical world. You have to work with them, do some kind of resonance with them. It's like they're here but they're not. So this is a very, very, very common mythological structure. But when the West needed to split from the church in order to be able to build basically its industrial revolution, there was a kind of a severing of memory. So this is, when I refer to the scar on the Western soul, this is what I'm talking about. A lot of people blame at Descartes, but Descartes actually rescued Western magic from a calcified church. Like the church at that point had ceased being there's a deeper principle to talk about here about the way that anytime you have a wisdom tradition, anytime you have any kind of wisdom practice that becomes big and starts to have to contend with political forces, it by default, it will either become political and thereby lose its thread of wisdom, not entirely, but it'll lose most of it in order to be effective politically. It's like I'm entering the battlefield, so how much peace can I really care about? Right? Jesus Christ, the Lord of Peace, creates the Crusades. Like there's an irony there. Right? So Prince of Peace, sorry, the Prince of Peace. Either these big institutions will lose their thread of wisdom, or they get destroyed. Right? This is an issue of the global memetic war. It's one of the challenges that we have to face intelligently if we want to have a sane, wise human race. If we want our species to be conscious, not just as individuals, but as a collective, if we want to have something that is beautiful and powerful and that actually honors all of our nature and cares for that, we can't do it naively. It can't be done. If we try to do it as, just believe in peace, you end up with postmodern confusion. So I'll talk about the postmodern confusion in a different case. There's a lot to talk about postmodernism, but in particular what it is, what I'm talking about. So what had happened was that Christianity had started out as a very powerful psychotechnology, like the way that language is a psychotechnology. It is a mental tech that allows us to think more effectively and to form groups in more effective ways, to go through internal transformation and be more attuned to reality and to truth. It was a very, very powerful system. It was, among other things, a synthesis of the power of the heart, of love, of compassion, and the ideas of Neoplatonism, which themselves seem to have origins back in Gnosticism. There's some common threads and elements here. Very, very potent stuff, incredibly potent stuff. There's a reason why Christendom dominated the Western world for 1,000 years. Intensely powerful. It wasn't just political. The reason it could be political is because there was actual real power at its core. That's a theme you'll find over and over again. Anytime something has inherent power, it's because there's truth at its core, which is different from having relative power, which is often a matter of tricking people into being distracted from the lies that you are telling. But lots to say there. To try to zoom back in. So by the middle of the second millennium, I think just call it 1500s, the church had become kind of calcified. It had become a political machine because it had to be. That doesn't mean it had no wisdom left, but it was that wasn't what it was incentivized to do anymore. And that's why the Reformation happened. Martin Luther's whole business with with nailing his 95 theses on the wall of the church and starting the Protestant Revolution, and fracturing Christianity into all of these different factions. So that a lot of that came from this need to say, hey, like we need some flexibility here. There's some mental hangers that I have for this that I find helpful. Roughly speaking, if you want to know the relevant pivot points for the Western world over the last 1,000 years, the key pivot points were the Black Death in the 1300s and the creation of modernism, especially with Isaac Newton paving the way for a particular way of thinking about physics, but all the things associated with that. That's late 1600s, early 1700s. Almost everything else is some variation on the impacts of those two. And I'm being massively over simple here, but if you can sort of imagine that roughly 1300s, well, I guess from your perspective, this is the line of time. Boom, like Christ, whoop, here you have 1300s, and Black Death destabilizes the Western world. This creates room for the church to be challenged by people like Martin Luther, and then later the advent of the scientific revolution, which eventually went to Newton, 1700s, well, 1600s, late 1600s, where Newton created the modern way of thinking. I'm again being oversimple. He didn't really create it, but he nucleated it. Okay. So with that kind of context, with that kind of understanding, the kind of move, like one way of understanding the move that Newton did was he extracted Western magic from its wisdom traditions. This sounds a very controversial way of describing it, but it's actually quite factual. This is not too, like when you dig into the history of this stuff, it ends up being incredibly evident. This is exactly what happened. Isaac Newton was a practicing alchemist. He was very familiar with Hermetic thought. I haven't described a whole lot about Hermeticism here, but Hermeticism is sort of the underground spiritual practice of the West. Is where we get our images of wizards and, to a large extent, witches from. It's when you talk about the fantasy genre is pulling very, very heavily from Hermeticism. So the Western ideas of magic and of magical power, like the whole Harry Potter thing, this is soaking in alchemy. Alchemy is one of the Hermetic arts, as is astrology. All of science came from Hermeticism, plus a couple of other bits and pieces, but its parent is Hermeticism, the explicit practice of magic as a way of aligning with the deeper reality. So there was a kind of move that had to be made that actually Descartes trying to remember. I think Descartes was about a generation before Newton, so early 1600s. Descartes basically proposed severing the upper world from the physical world, and suggested that the church have all say over what is involved in contact with the higher world, and science just be doing this little stuff with the physical world. And if it ever contradicts the church is of course correct. But this created a problem because it supposed a division. This is the scar. This is the cut that produced the scar. So the way that we experience this today is there's this kind of there's this question of what's it all for? Right? That we're very bad at asking, and that to some large extent we avoid asking. What is it for? We had a clear answer 1,000 years ago. It is for God's plan. Even 500 years ago, we had some intuitions. There's some kind of thing that, because of the Renaissance, because of the reclaiming of a lot of mostly Hermetic thought. It's largely Hermeticism that created the the Renaissance and thereafter that allowed room for the Enlightenment. But this business of oh, I added too many footnotes. What was I saying there? Oh, right. So for finding purpose. So 500 years ago, there is this this quality and tone of coming to understand. And by coming to understand, you become more divine. We still have this intuition concept of divinity, that there is something to align with, that there is an upper world, a higher world, a true world to align with. We still have that. You see clear threads of it even in like Shakespeare's plays. Right? These transformations, and these the transformations that people were ideally going through in the course of watching one of these plays with all of this alchemical symbolism. I'll probably talk about this at some point, but if you're ever curious, if you look up hogwartsprofessor.com, there's tons in there about seeing literary alchemy. A lot of this, a lot of the transformational power that is in Shakespeare's work comes from the resonance in the Western soul with this particular way of describing the transformation of oneself from a leaden state of mundanity into the gold. Like the transformation of lead into gold, of the alchemical transformation of going through the 3 stages, which is where we get the 3 acts of plays from: Negredo, Albedo, Rubedo, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, which has lost some of its clear connotations there over time. But this, we had something to align with 500 years ago. But as science claimed its demonstrable ability to resonate with truth under a paradigm that it was denying the existence of the higher world, which is actually, it's inherently contradictory. Like where are these physical laws that it's talking about? The reason we call them laws is because Newton was highlighting that these are laws of God. And he was trying to describe a process of aligning to a deeper truth. And because of the kind of the sort of deal and game that the Western world had to play, it started sidestepping that entire point and going, well, we can use Newton's magic, we can use Newton's sorcery by renaming it so that we aren't talking about magic. And the terms magic and sorcery were not common terms for what he was doing at the time anymore, but he was doing alchemy, very explicitly doing alchemy. So we just reframe it so we remove all of the inner transformation and alignment parts, so that we are only looking at the external physical world as though there is this split between observer and observed, so that it's possible to observe something without interacting with it, and then we can understand it at a distance. This became like that. That is the feeling. That is the scar in the Western soul. That is the breach that makes it so that it feels like we can't contact something greater. This split between observer and observed. That's it. If you can see that, and if you can feel it, then you have some intuition about how to stop being confused by all of these befuddling stories that we're getting drowned in today. So I want to talk about a little bit about how that gets reflected in the modern world, but I see there's a comment here. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Looks like I pronounce it Thin Nguendai. Says, I never looked much into astrology, but I do recall vividly someone asking a question like, how could someone like Carl Jung come to take astrology seriously? As if it's self-evidently true that there's nothing truthful or of value about astrology. Interesting how we've come to view those practices nowadays. Like Tin Nguendai. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So yeah, that is an excellent point. I don't want to focus too much specifically on astrology, but at least in this one, there's a lot to say about astrology, and depending on what you mean by practicing astrologer, arguably I am a practicing astrologer. Arguably, it's more like I'm a neo-hermeticist, I think might be a better way of describing that. But anyway, that's for an entirely different thing. I'll do an episode here. I'll do a live stream on Hermeticism and actual Western magic at some point soon. I'm also thinking of creating a container where, if people want to actually use this as a meaning-making framework, you can sort of see a way to do that in a way that actually addresses some of the postmodern confusions. But that requires some context. So I'm going to focus on the context here. Yeah, so specifically with how could someone like Carl Jung come to take astrology seriously? Yeah, so that is exactly, so there's a particular immune system reaction. Like it's I'm not go too much into that, but there's a particular immune system reaction that was necessary for Western science to purge itself of the influence of the church, but it ended up enacting and sort of widening this wound in the Western soul, which is to move from spirituality isn't our domain to spirituality doesn't exist. And anyone and anything that claims that there is spirituality is confused. Does it sound like anything? Right, so there's this thing of, how could someone like Carl Jung come to take astrology seriously? Same thing with debunkers, modern debunkers. This has become less of a tenacious thing. This was a lot bigger about 20 years ago, on the turn of the millennium. But they're like atheist. Like if somebody is an atheist, this often carries this connotation of them viewing people who believe in God as stupid. But the move that they do is a very particular one. It's important to observe this, observe it very carefully. It's one of the reasons why people who lean in a more resonant with postmodernist direction, I realize I keep using this term, postmodernist, and the term kind of floats around and I haven't defined it. I'm basically not going to. So if you can just kind of vibe with the definition, maybe try to look it up. It's a mess out there. I'll go into postmodernism in a future session. But as somebody who sort of vibes with postmodernism, but also doesn't believe in the vision of God the Father in the sky created the world and is somehow omnipotent, like it can do anything and is everywhere and is all loving, like a sky daddy. And like if you don't believe in that, then technically that makes you an atheist, but it's sort of weird to call yourself an atheist. So you call yourself an agnostic because maybe there's something, but I don't think it's that. I guess I don't know, right? So a lot of people, this is also why a lot of people refer to themselves as spiritual but not religious. Because there's this image that gets projected onto religion, which a lot of religious people end up taking on as well because of the Western scar. This vision of God as a being like us, but big. The Gnostics had a name for this. It was actually a warning. The name of this being is the Demiurge. Sometimes you'll encounter its name as Yaldabaoth, which is, I don't know where it comes from, but Yaldabaoth, I'm told, means born from chaos. And it is the god that thinks it is a god, but is actually just an image and a projection. It thinks it's the creator. Demiurge is basically means creator, the creator being. But it is not, it is importantly, the Demiurge cannot be a reflection of the true God. And it's sort of unfortunate to use the word God here because God carries the connotation of the Demiurge. So there's a move that it's technically a strawman argument. If you look up strawman argument, this is absolutely the kind of thing that it is. And it's just, unfortunately, all we ever talk about anymore is the strawman in these like atheist versus religious folk type of argument, which is that if you believe in God, you must believe in a stupid version. You must believe in a demiurge, and obviously a demiurge doesn't exist. That is stupid. Therefore, you are stupid for believing it. Right? It's that kind of, right? It's this weird thing. The reason for it is that there is a need on the part of the Western magic traditions, the most successful Western magic tradition. I'm going to keep poking at this. I know what science hates being called a form of magic. It's like, you're not really getting the thing, but I absolutely am. My master's degree is in mathematics. I get physics. I'm not claiming that this is about quantum physics proves that consciousness creates your reality. That drives me nuts. It's stupid. People who say that don't understand what quantum mechanics is actually saying. Right? So I'm not doing the hand-wavy quantum mysticism stuff. Okay? But I am saying, absolutely, science is a branch of magic. Most of the things that get called magic, in the sense of like sorcery, like the kinds of stuff that Harry Potter stuff is named after, this stuff has lost its wisdom core and has alienated itself from the main Western claim of magical power, which is science. So you end up with these weird, warpy ways of thinking that sometimes can do interesting coincidental stuff, but most of the time are just really, really confused. But the main thing they're trying to do is reclaim the spirit side, saying, no, I think there really is something more. God is not just a demiurge. There's something bigger. We just won't call it God. Maybe we'll call it source. Let's call it source. That fixes it, right? We're going to resonate with source by getting into a higher frequency so that source can flow through us more fully. And this allows for a blissful life. It's exactly Neoplatonism. All this law of attraction stuff, it's exactly Neoplatonism. It's the same thing. It's just rebranded. It's rebranded in order to kind of sidestep the assault that the scientific allergy to anything spiritual brings. That sentence was structured weirdly. What I mean is, the purpose of the rebranding is to make it so that that rebranding can survive the assault of the fixated scientific view. So, Sarah, I'm I'm not really sure what you mean when you post an image of a bee. You've done this before, and yeah, if you could translate that for me, I think I somehow missed this meme. So, but I'm glad you're interacting. But if you could translate that for me, I would love to understand in the future. Ian, you're asking, say more, please. Could say more of what? Oh, just bumping the algorithm. Thanks, Sarah. Okay. So, yeah. So, Ian, if you specify when you're saying "say more," please. If you give me a little more detail, I'm probably happy to, but I need to know what you're asking for. So, in terms of the way that we, she's just glad to be here with you. Cool. It's a pun that stings. So, raised in a family where one of our primary love languages is dad jokes. So, all right. 10 adds. Just to know where you're going, could you give one example of what the salvation structure you're talking about looks like in the modern world? Yes, absolutely. I can give several. Okay. So one example, although let me add a preface, because this is likely to trigger memetic immune systems, okay. Which is to say, it will create a kind of, by default, when I name these things, it's going to create a kind of reactivity, because it lands too similar to a type of attack on certain ideas that people hold sacred. I do mean to challenge the nature of how people are orienting to what they're calling sacred, or what they're implicitly embodying as sacred. But I'm doing it in the name of truth. I mean, this is not a standard attack. Okay. So I'm saying that because, so in particular, I'm going to critique some social movements, but I'm not critiquing the content of what they're caring for. What I'm critiquing is how they're doing it. Okay? The how they're doing it is a reenactment of something that in fact usually does not honor what it is that they are trying to protect. Okay? So I want you to, if you can, highlight that distinction, because if you can't, if you get sucked into the into the memetic immune system response that lives inside you, you won't be able to hear my meaning. That's part of how we've stayed confused. So if you can make that distinction, that'll help a lot. So examples. The entire saviorist arc that is behind activism is like this. Okay? The nature of let me grab specifically. It's a little dangerous to say wokeism because wokeism doesn't like to be named, but that's fine. I want to acknowledge it doesn't like to be named. It wants to claim that there isn't really a thing. That's great. Given that there's a thing there, even if it claims it's not there, it has to be there to claim it. This is one of the postmodern tricks. Wokeism, let me grab specifically anti-racism. I don't think there's a lot of objection to anti-racism being a thing that exists as a movement, as an egregore. People don't use the term egregore. The idea of anti-racism, this actually emphasizes the lower world rather than the higher world, because it's more okay to talk about the lower world explicitly. It is possible to go to hell, even if there isn't an option for salvation. So in anti-racism, there is this idea of sin. They don't call it sin, they call it racism. It is a corruption that warps the soul and it rots culture. It causes damage to everybody. That's the narrative, it's part of the structure. And so in order to engage in a meaningful life, the thing that you need to do is find a way to purify yourself. This particular one, it actually holds a lot in common with with Catholic purification by pain that got inherited very strongly by the specific thread of Protestantism that went through John Calvin. Calvinism, which is it's the dominant memetic thread of Christianity that entered the United States. So you'll find this theme a lot. The Calvinist thread is that we are despicable creatures, huge emphasis on original sin, and that it takes a tremendous amount of work to purify yourself and to stay pure, but also you're not up to the task because you're such a schmuck. Because like calling it schmuck is like maybe a little warpy because it's like bringing in a bit of Yiddish, but you're so corrupt, you are so irredeemably inherently wicked that it is only by God's infinite, incomprehensible grace that is not up to you that you are able to be purified at all. So really, the only choice you have is that you can turn away from God's grace. You can damn yourself. But it's not really up to you whether you're saved or not. But if you work really, really hard and you're willing to go through and punish yourself for your own wickedness to purge the evil from yourself, this opens yourself up to the infinite mercy of the Lord. So this has all of the components that you need for a really intense meaning-making system. It highlights a kind of cosmic meaning, like this is how you participate in God's plan. And there's an order to the universe, a way of orienting to the universe. And it boils down to something you can do. It's not just abstract philosophy of look at this great plan and isn't that cool, isn't that neat philosophy. It comes right down to this question of, and what are you doing this afternoon? How are you going to work on purifying yourself this afternoon? Have you prayed today? Are you going to church? Have you donated to the community? Specific actions, what are you doing? So those two components sort of create almost like the electric and positive poles of an electric current. That's what creates this sense of a meaning-making system. You have a framework of the world that tells you what to do. Now you have a way of orienting. So anti-racism has this Calvinist structure to it, this purification of original sin that you are obliged to do. And if you don't do it, you go to hell. What is hell? Well, it's not about an afterlife, because if you talk about the afterlife, you're going to have to touch on spirit, and this starts to interject a lot of the Western immune reaction to actually taking the higher world seriously. So this is one of these weird cases where you have the motivation of avoiding the lower world, but there is no higher world to go to instead. right? There's what is the vision of anti-racism? What's the end game? This is something you'll find over and over again because we've severed ourselves off. There's no end game. There's no, instead, let's live in this world. You have some individuals who will say this, but there's no coherent agreement in anti-racism. It's let's get rid of racism. But what does that look like? Does that mean we ignore race, that race stops being a thing we even talk about? But notice how when you try to name that, when you try to name, let's make it so that race isn't a thing you talk about. Oh man, here is a white guy saying, let's not talk about race. Man, that is so privileged. Right? The reason for that is, if you were to aim for an image, aim for a vision where there is actually a resolution of all racism, then the anti-racism system would no longer be a way to make meaning, and you would be faced with the nihilism that is the soul ache of the Western scar. Okay. So that's one example. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of examples of this. QAnon is a weird, warpy example of this thing. Okay. It's just the way that you would participate in QAnon is you be informed. And if other QAnoners are gathering, then you gather or something. Right? But just being informed is enough. To participate in this great salvation from, what is it, the shape-shifting lizard aliens, I think this was, more of the Raelian stuff. I looked into this when it was a big thing, but I've honestly forgotten. It sounded like it was a recreation of David Icke's stuff where the Queen of England is supposedly a lizard person or something. And I smirk and I sort of kind of mock it. What I'm saying doesn't require dismissing or disproving any of these paradigms, although I'm willing to say QAnon is confused. But I don't care. I don't care for the thing that I'm actually saying. But that's another example of the type of thing. Yet another example is, so Ian's asking, so QAnon and anti-racism are following a similar meme? They have a common memetic ancestry in terms of their strategy for making meaning. Okay? But anti-racism takes much more strongly after the Calvinist portion, whereas QAnon is trying to much more directly go for rapture. QAnon takes the rapture thread, the idea of that there will be a second coming of Christ who will arrive and lift us out of the horrors of the Gnostic prison hell that the Demiurge holds. Because the Demiurge is a villain in Gnosticism. It's worth bearing in mind. God as a being is a villain. Right, this is something that's forgotten. The image of the devil, not the visual image, but like that is actually a better representation of the devil. The idea is the devil is ruling the world. You have some ideas like this floating around in modern Christianity, but it's incoherent because they just view God as a bigger demiurge, and then it gets confused. But QAnon has this sense of when they were at their peak, I think they were viewing Trump as, like, they wouldn't say it this way, but as the second coming, that he was going to save us all by bringing in grace and lifting us out of the horror realm of all of these demons holding us. Like all of these I think it was supposed to be pedophile, blood-drinking reptile monsters, or like it was something like that. Like all of our politicians were that or something. Yeah, it was some kind of thing like that. So there's the core thing is that this element, like this is true of almost all meaning-making systems, that there is this cosmological view that lets you orient to the world and make meaning of chaos. And it also includes this element of, within that order, there is a clear thing that you can do. It's not just watch this TV show, it's this is what you can do. But notice, like anti-racism, QAnon avoids the question of the higher world. There is no sense of there being a divine plan that is orchestrating the existence of the physical world to begin with. There is no answer to the question of where consciousness comes from, or what that feeling of absolute utter sacredness is when you see beauty or you look into the eyes of your newborn child. None of that in these things, because they can't afford to. They don't have the memetic structure to be able to orient to the Western scar. So they find these step around. So both of them end up having this weird postmodern double step thing where they're avoiding admitting that anything can actually be true, but this thing right here, this is true. Right? So that part's common. My clap was way louder than intended. Sorry about that. Okay. There's one other quick example, just because these are not just random things. This permeates. Another example is activism, the way that activism is done today. Like you find this in environmental activism where people are going around holding signs. This is, again, we are at risk of damnation. And it is only by, in this case, this actually takes after, interestingly enough, this is a thread that is common between anti-racism and a lot of activism. It actually shares a common memetic thread with the Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of the witches, the foundation of the witch trials. And there's the idea is that instead of purifying yourself within, you are purifying the world without. Also the same source, the same memetic origin as the Crusades. You are going forth and purifying the world by active assault on evil. If you can destroy the evil out in the world and participate in the attack, then you are participating in your own salvation. Which, just like with the anti-racism, run into an interesting problem of if you were to succeed, your meaning-making system would fall apart. So built into the effort, you dare not succeed. Not to say that there's a lack of sincerity on the people involved. I'm just like, this is the structure. This is where the meaning-making engine works. So those are just some examples. See Brandon bringing in a friend of mine years ago who went through some trauma mentioned to me that she has sometimes felt like running away from something without care as to where because it felt so horrible. I threw out the thought that she must have felt that somewhere else was better, and she couldn't grasp that alternative perspective of going after something better. Yeah, this is the postmodern knot. Trapped in, it's actually because of the way that the global memetic war is going, the war of the egregores, where the egregores that move through us can move us faster in a warlike fashion if we can be controlled in a stunned way, like if our physical nervous system is actually constantly overwhelmed. So we're going between alarm and shutdown, alarm, shutdown, instead of vast perspective that gives us this sense of calm presence, capable of acting, but at peace and radiantly compassionate. That's a state to cultivate, and it's part of what the old wisdom traditions would encourage. But if you do that, a lot of the modern ideas can't possess you. So a lot of these modern ideas, a lot of these modern movements, the egregores had motivation to encourage more and more fracturing of awareness, so that instead of going towards something, you're going away from something. Absolutely permeates the postmodern world. Okay, and then Ian clarified a little earlier what you were saying about the law of attraction being just a repeat of the past. Yeah, so this is, so all power that manifests in the physical world, I want to say all creative power, all magic. It's worth noticing the word magic has something in common with magistrate. The mag part is about power. You talked about the other day with Dispenza as well. Yeah. So, magic is actually, it's a gesture towards power, but real power is not this this mechanical power over, like like the way that Putin has power. Putin's power, I'm guessing, like I don't think he's operating as a mage. I don't think he's operating as an enlightened being. My impression is that he is possessed by a kind of archetype. and that he's constrained by an archetype. At some point, I may go into this. It's a type of thing that I think is really useful to see. When you can actually see archetypal possession in the world, it starts to become a lot clearer that what we're dealing with is not a bunch of people with ideas and we're going to do with the ideas and blah, blah, blah. It's more like there are these forces that are a kind of intelligent that possess groups of people and nations, but also individuals. And then those forces are playing out ancient dramas over and over and over and over again, and ramping up the volume over time. So, and so that's a kind of mechanical in the 3D world sort of power. But true creative power, the power that brings in something novel, sort of power that Isaac Newton expressed by creating physics. Like the word physics existed before. Physics is the Greek word for nature, and it was the name of a book by Aristotle where he described his theory about the structure of motion. He wrote a book called After Nature where he described the structure of the cosmos in a similar fashion, the movement of the stars and the idea of the ether. That, like, after nature in Greek is metaphysics or metaphysikos, which is where we get our concept of metaphysics from. So those terms existed before, but Newton brought in, he invented physics as we know it today. He invented Western scientific power through a mathematical understanding. In that particular way, he invented mathematical physics. So what is the power that does that? You cannot answer that by working within the physical realm. You have to tie into something that is more fundamental than physical. I realize here I'm doing the great I'm doing the great Western heresy, right? I'm talking about I'm giving this implication that there is a world beyond the physical, which tends to mean that I'm talking about a demiurge or some kind of patent, some kind of religious thing, like, oh, there is a spirit realm. There absolutely is a spirit realm. There's no question there's a spirit realm. But it is more like an expansion of the physical realm. It is what happens when you stop constricting your vision to just this, and instead open up to a recognition that, for instance, you know the feeling difference between jazz and classical music. Where do you feel that difference? It's not because of a physical sensation of what the vibrations do to your body. It isn't because you just have these random associations. There's something deeper than a knowing of information that rings through your being. What level are you feeling that at? I'm not claiming this is beyond the capacity of relationship to the physical world. I'm saying that there's something deeper, something obviously there. But this is the great Western heresy. So I'm sure I sound like a nut job to people who have aligned themselves with science. And then there's an equivalent version for people who believe in magic and spirituality and law of attraction, which is that they think they see the world clearly with this image of there is source, and source interacts with the world. Like these are different things. What I'm talking about is vastly deeper than this. What I'm talking about is something about healing the Western scar. So please bear in mind that when I'm naming these things, it's very easy to mishear me, because most minds that are going to be listening to this are listening through a scarred mind and a scarred heart. So if you are listening to this, you're part of the westernized world. And that means that you have inherited some piece of this confusion. What I am naming is exactly dealing with this confusion. So real power comes from grokking this and connecting to the higher world and acting as a vessel for the higher world to manifest in its form as the physical world. And thank you, Sarah. Sarah says you are a great teacher. You. So the Neoplatonic strategy, I'm getting over to the law of attraction question. Okay. The Neoplatonic strategy for attuning to this was a recognition of the way that the Neoplatonists talked about this is that there is a realm even beyond heaven, the realm of ideal forms. This is where mathematics gives you a glimpse into. But even when you draw the mathematical ideas, these are actually shadows in your mind. Your knowing attunes to something that is even beyond what your mind creates images of, because anything you can experience is itself a shadow cast. This is Plato's allegory of the cave. Everything we experience is a kind of shadow of the real. So if you can sort of attune to this reality of the ideal forms, and then those ideal forms give you a kind of power that is impossible to recognize prior to the connection, but afterwards is unmistakable. Okay. Absolutely unmistakable. Okay. So now that, because of the Western scarring, became this idea of there's the realm of form and then there's the physical world, which you see in science today as there are mathematical laws that manifest in physical experiments and in our physical world. But you dare not ask, where are the laws of physics? That's trying to cross the scar. Right? You're not allowed to ask that question. It makes you sound kooky. Oh, that's a stupid question. Is it? These physical laws can control the physical world. They are stronger than any of our abilities to manipulate matter. In fact, they define our ability to manipulate matter. So where is that power? Where does it come from? Yeah, but let's not ask that question, right? So, so the scientific answer is don't ask that question. The neo-mystical answer is let's pretend there's another world where we can channel stuff from. So they treat it as though, oh, this is a matter of attuning to these forms. And then because you get tuned to them, like you find this in the idea of the spirit world that shamans go to. They go to this other world where they encounter spirit. They bring the spirit in and then come back into the physical world in order to bring the spirit's power. But that's not what the shamans actually experience. Maybe in some traditions, maybe they hallucinate a particular thing, and maybe there's some branch of mysticism that or some branch of shamanism that I'm unfamiliar with that does it like this successfully, that isn't just doing a mental hallucination. But if you actually do this practice, and I've done this practice a number of times, arguably I am a shaman, but I think I'm something else at this point. But the actual experience is something more like opening perspective, remembering the vastness of is, and taking some piece of that remembrance and bringing it back below the veil of forgetting. It is one reality. It's just that there's a particular part where you sort of play peekaboo, and when you're hidden, you forget that there's a thing above. There's a whole thing to talk about there. There's something to refer to in terms of what heaven is, what all these, what self-realization, or as Jung called it, individuation, what all those things are. That's its own arc. But the law of attraction is following this mystical stuff. It's the same kind of thread that showed up in elements of theosophy and in New Thought, and it shows up in the modern world. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's this business of trying to attune to a higher world in order to bring in power, which is the right formula, but it's hopping over the Western scar. It's treating it as though if you think something bad, then you might go to hell, right? So to have a good life, you have to attune to heaven. Right? Think positive thoughts, raise your vibrations, stay positive. You are the creator of your own world. Doesn't that feel powerful? Really lean into that power. Isn't this amazing? We'll ignore the fact that while we're busy talking about this feeling amazing, we're really stressed about whether we can pay rent this month. Just as a general thing across the board, one major sign you are dealing with somebody whose paradigm of magic is really confused. And I include scientists in this, right? This is across the board. A big sign you're dealing with somebody who does not understand magical process is if not only do they struggle to pay their rent, right, but if they've been struggling to pay their rent for a long time, okay, now it says something if they're able to make coincidences happen that let them just deal with it. This is just one example of many. It's just like one place where you can say, how powerful of a wizard are you? Like, what is your capacity as a mage? It's like, can you actually pay the rent? The reason is that, like, everybody has struggles, and like I've had difficulty paying rent too. Like, this, like, just pragmatically, it's like, okay, this is going to be a struggle, a squeeze, but it comes from somewhere. And somebody who systematically cannot deal with that and is not orienting to it, but thinks they have a strategy, means that they're living in a delusion. They're living in the matrix. They're just living in a different matrix, slightly different matrix. Okay. So this thing I keep seeing with law of attraction people, where they have the same kinds of relationship problems, but they're all this exciting stuff is happening because they're pouring all of this life force energy into actually changing their lives. They're actually creating neat stuff, but they're not dealing with the lower world. They're not excavating the parts of themselves that they have banished to Hades, the Jungian shadow. They aren't processing this. In fact, they're avoiding it because, man, if you face the shadow, then you're going to feel bad, and that's going to make you feel bad vibes, and that might create your reality in a bad way, and that's bad. So I don't want anything bad. So let me not do that work, which is another way of expressing the original thing that created the Western scar. There's a vivid clarity to all of this when you learn how to see it and you learn how to feel into it. I see you say, oh, I like this. Cool. So I'm going to lay that as landed. Okay. I see you mentioned that it has been a shift I've been making through, this is Ian saying this. This is a shift I've been making through the dispensa perspectives, the quantum, the divine spirit. I co-create as the divine with the divine, like calling out to myself, not separate. Yeah. Yeah. Let's add a little bit of a non-duality, I guess we'll say. Brandon says, would a good analogy be the difference between treating health symptoms and looking into what root causes led to the symptoms? Yes. Yep. That's a great analogy. Tin says, this makes me want to ponder what a stupid question even is. Yeah. As a quick note on that one, I'll say quick, like I'm terrible at quick, but a stupid question, like the concept of a stupid question, the point of that memetic structure, that's a stupid question. Like where does that memetic movement, that energetic movement, where does it come from? It is an act of shame or of judgment that is meant to induce a certain form of pain in order to create a contraction that prevents a certain type of vision. It restrains movement so that movement becomes more predictable to the egregore. Okay. So for the most part, yeah, there's there's a generalization to make there, but hopefully you can feel that piece there. Although there's a different move that you could make that I think is the same mistake phrased differently or from a slightly different angle, which is to say, oh, well, that means saying something is a stupid question is a mistake, and I need to make myself not do that. That doesn't address the reason why you're inclined to do it in the first place, which is to say, you are pushing the piece of like that particular like finger of the egregore, you're pushing that into Hades. You're giving it contact with all of the powers of hell if you're trying to suppress it. So the idea is not to make yourself not view things as stupid questions. It's that there is a different way of relating, a very different way of relating to the movement of memetic forces that go through you that can allow a kind of lucidity that, among other things, can heal the version of this scar that lives inside you. Brandon brings in, if indeed there is a source, it is the source of both the positive and negative things. So if you want to increase your awareness of it and work with it more, you would have to be able to face both, not just one. Yeah? Yeah. I like that too. I see someone else liked it. Yep. Okay. So to recap, there is this sort of these sort of arcs of like ways of orienting to these other worlds. And these myths exist throughout I keep emphasizing the West, but like these are close to universal. In the sense of other world, that there's an other place to go or to be. And largely speaking, the sort of threads of dealing with this that you'll see, there are only a couple of strategies for orienting to having actual power that you'll see. Some of them have to do with escaping the lower world and trying to purify yourself of its influence. This is, for instance, the Calvinist approach. You'll have things that have to do with entirely pleading to, resonating with, seeking salvation of the upper world. You see this in QAnon, you see this in Law of Attraction. There are these, and you'll have like the scientific materialist way of doing it. This is one example I didn't really go into very much here, but you'll see the same thread here. That if science actually were to follow its reasoning pathway all the way in terms of how this is the only world, there aren't other worlds, there is no point, it's not for anything. Any kind of abstraction you make is something sort of internally created. They have a self-reference problem when they try to do that. But if they ignore that, there's a particular way of mechanism of doing that. There's a basic problem in that like this is the source of nihilism. This is why there is a pointlessness to it all. The nihilism that inspired things like the Nazis, right? Like the Nazi will to power, like borrowing from Nietzsche, came from a need to deal with this problem. And their way of orienting to it, the scientific way of orienting to it, if they were to follow it all of the way, there'd be no point in their pursuit of knowledge. It wouldn't matter whether humanity lives or dies. It wouldn't matter whether we flourish, whether there's more suffering, whether we create a utopia. It doesn't matter, because all of the mattering is purely illusion. It's just molecules bumping around. So if you really get that, what's the point? In fact, if you care about something else, that might deviate you from the clarity of seeing reality truthfully, and that's the closest thing that science has to a sin, the sin of delusion. So what you find, instead of really orienting to this and using this to break the scientific stranglehold on the importance of avoiding acknowledging an upper world, what you find instead is a flip to another strategy of avoiding the lower world. The lower world is the world of confusion and delusion. You think there's a God? How dumb of you, how ignorant. Oh, you think that it's possible to do these miraculous healings with prayer, or that these spirit journeys are actually journeying anywhere. Well, let's debunk this. Let's set up this experiment to show you how stupid you are, how stupid these people are. Do you notice how the debunking strategy has nothing to do with syncing up, saying, oh, you believe this, this is important to you. I disagree, and I think I see something you don't. Are you open to me showing you? Because I think that there's something that you would want to see, because I believe that you care about truth as well. Right? There's none of that charity in the debunking stuff. The debunking stuff is more displaying how smart they are, how pure they are, how immune to the corruption of confusion, the corruption of religious belief and pseudoscience and quackery. I am not confused by those things. I am pure. I believe the science. Right? So it's more of this purity myth. It's the same purity myth. They just can't admit it because they can't acknowledge other worlds. They've even put acknowledgement of the shadow realm into the shadow. So it's super confused as a meaning-making system. Right? So as you learn to see these things, there's a type of thing that sort of lights up in your perspective. It becomes something that it's a lot more obvious where a lot of the modern confusions are coming from. Okay. So I advise you just give this time to sink in. You don't have to understand or follow all these pieces. I'll touch on all these same points in other variations at other angles in other of these weekly sessions as well. So this is not a matter of catching everything. It's letting land whatever lands. Okay. I see there's a couple things here. Ian says, I struggle with holding that sometimes. Everything matters / nothing matters. Yeah, and part of the reason for that is the Western turning to the mind as a substitute for God. Because if there's no upper world, then all you have are your thoughts. And the thoughts were the traditional Western way of attuning to the realm of ideal forms. So you end up in this, yeah, Tin mentions, I've just remembered that I have a body. Yeah, this stuff can be very exciting. And there's a practice involved in landing here. Not falling too far into the matrix so that you forget what's going on. So you just, oh wow, look at all these insights, look at all this understanding. Now this understanding happens in this flesh. Yeah. And then it doesn't matter whether everything matters or nothing matters, both and neither at the same time, because it's not for the mind. You just see it much more directly. Brandon says, I felt nihilistic as a teenager, and a thought hit me that somehow some part of me believed otherwise. Some part of me thought it was worthwhile to continue breathing and beating my heart, that I became curious of what that might be. Yep. I want to say something like, that's the body. But importantly, because of this Western scar, because of this confusion of the scientific worldview, which is zero to dismiss the power of science or even its veracity. What I'm highlighting is there's a glitch in the nature of its worldview that shows up, for instance, in its inability to even orient charitably to the hard problem of consciousness, about how there's anything, how it's like anything to experience subjectively at all. And so I'm not dismissing that at all when I'm saying the scientific worldview has this kind of crack or confusion in it. I'm describing a fact about it. Which doesn't mean, therefore, quantum mysticism. Okay. But it's important to bear in mind, I think it's helpful to bear in mind that when we talk about the body, the immediate thing a Western mind will do is focus on an image. We don't know what bodies are. In a very important way, we can't know what bodies are. The body is actually every bit as mysterious as the entire universe, including and especially the universe that is beyond our brain's 3D way of constructing our impressions of our environment. Because the body's part of it, right? So the source of that, when I say, oh yeah, this thing like cares about breathing and beating the heart, oh, that's the body. It's easy to hear that as a dismissal thing, like, oh yeah, of course, that's the body, duh. But the thing that Western minds do with this idea by default is they create this image, this icon of a body, and treat it as just a body, like just a machine. But that is exactly reducing it to the part that is already seen. Right? It's going into the mental image, the mental story. So in saying that's the body, I'm pointing to what I keep finding, certainly for myself, and it seems like for most Westernized people, is a big gateway for reattuning to the higher world. This recognition that mattering feels like something here, and that it's like something to feel my feet on the ground and to feel my breath. And that when I anchor here, all the nihilistic stuff just melts away, because the nihilism is an expression of the alienation of different parts of the Western soul. This process of getting into the body is exactly healing that gap. It's crossing that gap and sort of mending. No, I don't know if that's how you experience it, but that's vividly what comes up for me, particularly when you give these examples of it was worthwhile to continue breathing and beating my heart. Okay, so advice is after this, I don't advise thinking about this too much. Your mind will do thinking for you. And if you really want to, you can go around chewing on this, deciding things, but let it sink in. Let it sink in. If you're familiar with the practice of Shavasana, really good. And Brandon says my experience uses words with less letters in them. Here, you get a laugh there. Cool. So let it sink into your body. Let the impact of whatever you took from this sink into your body. Don't worry about capturing all of the meaning too much. That's not important. You'll be able to rewatch this. This will be on replay both on Facebook, and I'm planning on posting this to YouTube as well. And yeah, just what I would invite you to play with is notice what becomes alive for you as you look around. Like this is not just abstractions of, oh, those are interesting facts about some world I think about sometimes. This is stuff like when you see a tweet from somebody saying, man, here's this thing that this annoying person said that was really disrespectful to people's race, and they should really check their privilege. There's some nuance you can zoom in on and going, oh, right there, that's an example of the thing. Right there. Right. And if you can, if that's trivial to you, an invitation that's one step a little more nuanced, a little more complicated, see if you can feel the pain in there. Like you don't have to hurt, but just to notice, where is this scar showing up here? Not as an intellectual thing, but it feels like something in particular. Oh, the taste of desperation. If that's beyond you, that's fine. Let's come back to the body. Okay. So feel free to continue conversing about this, like bringing up questions and comments about this. I'm happy to keep chatting through the week about these things. But otherwise, I will be on next week. Thank you for visiting.